All right, guys, we're gonna start our first lesson. Remember, you need to have the notes open. They should be in your Google Classroom under Don't Open until I think 10-30, and then it should be the Chapter 3, Section 2. It might say Section 1 notes on it. They're the same. So we're going to start westward expansion. I know we briefly talked about the Oregon Trail last year, but this is a little bit different. This is going to talk about more of the things that we did to the Native Americans in our process for westward expansion. So, why does it matter? In 1787, the Constitution granted the federal government with the power to regulate trade, and that included with the Native Americans. This would create a long and strained relationship with the natives. Because of the rising population, the natives were forced west of the Mississippi, and they were promised that land forever. However, when the population grew rapidly, the required amount of space grew as well. And this pushes the natives even further away, making it aware that natives were going to lose their land. So, this is where they used to be. So there used to be like right in this region, and then as expansion grew, they were kind of pushed here. We're gonna see them being pushed into the Oklahoma area and a lot of other places. We're gonna skip through that. Well, let's go back. So this isn't something that you need to answer anywhere, but based on how the described land was, so this part right here, the Oklahoma Territory. If you know anything about Oklahoma, it's kind of dry. It's not a super desirable, not desirable, that's the word I'm looking for, but not a super, trying to think of this word here. Crops don't really grow here well. On top of it, it's a part of Tornado Alley. It is pretty dry, dusty, not a lot of good land. So based on what I described, you can obviously tell that the land is not desirable, is given to them because no one freaking wants it. That's it. So post-Civil War, over 250,000 natives resided in the land west of the Mississippi River, which created a diverse population of tribes, differing in languages, styles of homes, and cultural practices. The one thought they all shared in common was natives were a part of nature. Nature was sacred. Their idea was essentially that nobody owned nature. Nature cannot be owned. So the greatest change occurred when the settlers began pushing the border, and the discovery of gold and silver made the land desirable, which meant the natives were no longer welcome there. So by the late 1860s, natives were pushed onto reservations and were no longer allowed to roam the plains. As soon as you throw money in the mix, a lot of people start pushing off the rights of other people, especially if it means they can get rich in the process. So obviously, at this time, the nation of America is very racist. It does not take well with different cultures. They realize that they, in their mind, are superior to the natives. So in order to gain access to that land, they have to keep pushing the natives. And to do that, they have to start putting them onto reservations. Lastly, natives took a really large blow on top of two really large blows on top of all of this. The American bison was really important to the native society, being that they often roamed a little bit more. But due to overhunting by the settlers, that population had dwindled down to almost nothing. The other was the exposure to new diseases they did not have immunity to. Okay? This really does kill off a lot of people. It's not exactly great. Okay, we're also going to see a lot of exposure to smallpox, not smallpox, we're past that. Typhoid, dysentery, cholera, diphtheria, yellow fever. These are all sicknesses that we now have a lot of vaccines for and can treat. Yeah, bless me. All right, moving on. What could possibly go wrong? Literally everything. It gets worse. So it becomes the settlers versus the natives, and this whole idea of manifest destiny is how the white settlers use their justification to take this land. And so the 19th century doctrine or belief that the expansions of the US throughout the American continents was both justified and inevitable, meaning they cannot stop it. The natives will never be able to stop the entirety of the US population taking over what they determined as the United States, right? And so the increase of population only enforces this idea more, and it pushes people west to inhabit these lands to bring great profits to them, even advertising in the newspaper. Of course, the natives were not complying in this. Nobody ever just lays down and says, yeah, take my land, right? This is compliant in this as they believe their land, which sparked a series of rebellions. So the Siouxtra Native resisted the Minnesota region only to result in losing most of the land and pushed into the Dakotas, which each rebellion there became a deeper distrust towards natives. If people began to attack you, you're not generally going to be very trusting of that particular population. And so every time this got worse with every attack. And so the natives just kept going and doesn't realize that it kind of ruins it for them. So as a result, settlers in the Colorado region gather a militia and attack an unarmed camp of Cheyenne and Arapaho natives. I'm not sure that's the word I'm looking for. At Sand Creek, this massacring many men, women, and children. Okay, the Sand Creek Massacre rallied the natives and began round 2 of wars between natives and settlers. Large mass killings often are igniting factors in wars. For more recent times, Pearl Harbor, 9/11. In Europe, we'll talk about this later, but there is a shooting of a really important archduke in Serbia that starts the entirety of World War I. Okay, these generally are very much igniting factors in wars. So when you kill a bunch of people, including men, women, women and children, this is going to be something that really pushes people to get behind it, even if they are from different tribes. So the federal government sent troops to subdue the natives, allowing anyone to join, even encouraging any looting of natives captured or killed. However, the plan for the peace fails because of future plans for land set aside for the natives. The government breaks its promise, ... again. So the U.S. government only worsens the problems by announcing the plan to build a road right through the Sioux hunting grounds. Angering the natives more, some even began attacking the military figures and their forces. Despite reformers, humanitarians, and Western settler opinions, ultimately the U.S. Indian Peace Commission believed that peace would only be lasting if natives essentially gave up and assimilated into white culture. So we've talked about assimilation before. Assimilation is just adopting another culture. So the way that the U.S. sees it is that the white culture is the dominant culture. And if the natives don't want to die out and lose their ability to exist in the United States, they have to become more Western cultured, meaning they have to adopt the white culture. Obviously, the Native Americans are the most far west you can go before you get to Japan, which is technically the far east. But that is kind of where they've, come to decide is that if the natives don't do this, they'll die. I mean, if we think about this question for a minute, do you think the U.S. Indian Peace Commission was well received by the natives? I'll let you think about that for a second. I hope obviously some of you have realized that probably not. If you tell someone, hey, screw your culture, adopt mine, generally people don't react well to that. And that's a pretty good standard. Most people will not take that well. And the Native Americans are particularly proud in their culture and a very strong and defiant group of people. And I don't mean defiant in a bad way. They're not going to take it laying down, like I said. So to pacify the Sioux, The government decides to not build the road and abandon 3 forts in Fort Laramie in the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. However, despite all of the efforts, it was not a long-term fix to the situation. And that's because the government doesn't truly see the Native Americans as equals. And if you don't see someone as equal, you will not treat them as equals. For instance, let's take a look at this picture here. Here are all the men from the US government, right? And here are all the Native Americans from this tribe. Who is sitting below them? The Native Americans. You never sit above someone unless you find yourself to believe that they are better than you, especially you are better than them, especially in situations like this. Maybe not so much in everyday life, but think about this. Kings often sit in raised thrones in front of their subjects because they are better than everybody else. So it's the same concept. The natives were angry, and rightfully so. They were forced into isolated areas that were poverty-stricken and packed full of diseases. To top it all off, the natives were promised a lot of land, only for the US to call it back. Think of it this way. Your mom promises to get you an iPhone for Christmas. The brand new iPhone 12. I think that's what number we're on these days. She makes all these promises, and you trust your mom that she's going to get this for you. Now, obviously, this is not so much of a life or death situation. But Christmas time rolls around, and you open up all your gifts, and you never see that iPhone. Naturally, you're going to be let down. You might be a little upset, but imagine now that that iPhone was the difference between life or death for you, or the ability to even exist on land that is not occupied by other people who want to destroy your culture. You're gonna be mad. You're not even gonna be disappointed. You're gonna be mad. And so that's how the natives felt. Like, why do you keep giving me things and then taking them back? I'd rather you just be straight up and tell me I ain't gonna do it. And then we can just fight a war and move on. The Sioux's lands were invaded by gold rushers, which led to tensions between the settlers and the natives. Like I said, when money gets involved, people stop really caring about other people's feelings. um, Especially people who are not of great wealth. They're looking for that get rich quick scheme. And so the West is this land filled with gold pockets. And I say that with air quotations because there's actually not that much gold out in the West at this point. So people start flying to the West, thinking like, I'm gonna get rich, I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna be the most rich person in the United States. And when they do that, they start pushing these Native Americans further and further and further west until they are no longer anywhere else for them to go. So this tension is growing, and finally, Chiefs Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull Chiefs Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull assemble troops to drive them out. Colonel George Custer led the U.S. troops to match this uprising. It's going to be a pretty big one. And the frustrating thing is, as we look back and we realize the Chiefs Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull have the right idea. They're right in this situation. But back then, it seemed like they were very, very wrong, right? The U.S. force of roughly 250 men were completely surprised to find around 2,000 natives waiting for them. This natives charged at the Battle of Little Bighorn. This battle resulted in the decimated troops of Custer and his own death. The Battle of Little Bighorn is actually a fairly big win for the natives. However, they're going to still lose this land. And it's because after this great success, the army just regroups and then attacks again. And what happens is when they lose, a lot of them start fleeing to Canada because at this time, Canada is a relatively uninhabited place just because of how cold it is. And also it's, the further you get away from the coastline, the less likely people are to settle in it. So, especially in Canada where there's not a lot of warm land. So there's not a lot of people there. So Canada is an ideal place to go at this time. But the rest of them surrender. Which what happens to them? We'll find out. With the loss of many natives and their leaders, a cultural revival set in called ghost dances. And these are practices, this practice basically said that rituals would banish the white men and restore the bison population, which are two problems that natives are currently facing. So they would do these ghost dances in hopes to restore what used to be. And the U.S. government really wanted to deter this, as obviously it goes against everything they want to happen. And so they sent troops to arrest Sitting Bull at Wounded Knee, South Dakota. Things went awry, and over 100 natives were killed at Wounded Knee. Awry just means poorly. Obvious reasons, the U.S. government becomes a bit more hostile in this situation because imagine you walk in on a bunch of people doing a dance about banishing the white men. It's not going to really go over well with white people, even if, looking back, we might think the Native Americans are right. You may not. I'm just saying that looking back, it probably makes sense why they may have been doing these dances. So, however, not all of these natives wished to fight. Some wanted to flee their growing issues with settlers. Chief Joseph of the I never say this right, Nez Perces, that's not right, led his people on a 1,200-mile trek to Canada after being told they were forced to relocate. However, they were stopped short of the border, and this is really confusing to a lot of people. Because they just, like, you don't want me here, so why can't I leave? You don't want me here, but you force me to land I don't want, but the second I leave to go to a land that I do want that's not the United States, that you don't really make money off of me anyways, I'm stopped short of the border and then forced to the Oklahoma Territory? Confusing. On top of that, the Nez Perces, or go with that, was actually a pretty heavily Christian in faith tribe and in many ways assimilated a lot of white culture. So they didn't understand. They said, you want us to survive, we have to adopt, white culture, and we've done that. Why are we still not allowed to exist? We don't want to go to Oklahoma. We just want to live our lives. Let us leave. So the American solution, and I write it like this because when we talk about World War II, I'll teach you about something called the final solution. And a lot of people compare the treatment of the Native Americans to how the Jews treated the Germans treated the Jews. Okay, so after realizing that reservation policy was a big giant failure, the federal government had to come up with a new solution. And the brilliant idea that they had come up with was let the American bison die off, which would then force natives to assimilate. Again, we've talked about this. Assimilate is just adopting Western white culture in favor of their own. So their great idea was let's let a whole species die off, okay? And then because there's nothing for them to eat, they'll just become westernized human beings. And obviously that sounds like a bad idea to us, but to them, that's actually a pretty good idea. The government releases this statement. The American government will no longer recognize any Indian tribe or organization within the United States as an independent nation, tribe, or power that the government will contract treaties with. You have to think back a little bit. There was something called the Cherokee Nation, which I can't remember if we talked about now or if it was before last year. The Cherokee Nation is a really powerful tribe at this time. And they're called the Cherokee Nation because the United States treated them as a completely separate entity that exists within the U.S. And they did this with a lot of tribes. They saw the Sioux tribe as a separate entity. They saw the Apaches, the Shawnees, there's more of them, but I can't think of all of them. But all these tribes were seen as independent nations, that they were not a part of the American government. But essentially what they're saying is, I don't care. You are now people who will submit to the rule of our government, and if you cannot, we'll just take you over. That's essentially what this statement means. And obvious reasons this is not going to go over well with Native American tribes, because this is basically the United States saying, we're stripping you of your power, of your individual rights, and now you will become a U.S. citizen, whether you like it or not. After that, the United States is going to pass the Dawes General Allotment Act in 1887. This act replaced the reservation system with a 160-acre plot of land allotted to each Native American family. Now, people were well aware that Native Americans didn't really understand what was going on with this allotment of land because they didn't believe in, the idea of owning land. So being granted a 160-acre plot of land was huge for us, like as westernized people. So the government sees that there's a potential of people to trick the natives into selling their land. So they put a 25-year time limit on this land before anyone could sell it. So that way no one could magically acquire all this Native American land within 6 months after they get it. Although it was a ton of land, it was not enough land to actually farm in the West. One of the biggest issues about Oklahoma is that it's very dry, and you need triple the amount of land in Oklahoma to produce the same yields of crops that you would in Ohio. And that's particularly because Oklahoma is dry, arid. It does not rain. The soil is not nutrient dense. It's very sandy, and that's why the Dust Bowl will happen in a few years, a few decades actually. But we're not there yet. So although 160 acres of land sounds like a lot to farm on and to actually produce an income, it's not. Because only about 20 acres of that plot of land is actually going to be farmable every year. And so they needed almost triple that amount of land to even remotely produce something. And the other issue is the way that they determined families is very hard because Native Americans don't track families the same way we track families. So we live in a patriarchal society which tracks our lineage based on our fathers. That's why we take our father's last name generally. Okay? A lot of Native American tribes either A, didn't have a patriarchal society and didn't track last names. You basically adopted that family that you moved in with. So like a lot of times the men would move in with the female's family. And that would be a standard. So it becomes what's called a matriarchal society, and that would mean that we would take our mom's last name. However, Native Americans didn't have last names. They just had names because they're small tribes. So it was really hard for the United States to determine what a family was for them. And it kept them from being able to adequately provide Native Americans with the correct amount of land. So a lot of times what would happen is like 9 or 10 people would be living on this 160-acre plot of land, when in reality, they might have really only been 4 or 5 people who they considered their actual family. But it could also even be larger. Some people might be 25 people deep in their family. So 160-acre plot of land starts to become much smaller when you have more people. So the problem is this ultimately ended the culture of the Native Americans in the United States, partially due to legislation, but also because the numbers lost in battles and wars fought to preserve their culture. This fight was never really given up. The Native American culture is still pressing hard to obviously stop the taking away of their culture, their land, protecting sacred areas, or any type of basically holy grounds, Native American burial sites. It's obviously a little less violent. But remember, they lost a lot of people due to wars. The Battle of Little Bighorn, Wounded Knee Massacre, things like that. But they also lost a lot of people to sickness. We as Westerners have been exposed to a lot more sicknesses than Native Americans, especially those who had not really interact with Westernized settlers. So they're gonna get overexposed to all these sicknesses, and as we have a natural immunity to a lot of things, they don't. So I think I've talked about Mexican water. That's a good example. They have built up an immunity to their water, but we drink it, we get sick. Same concept. I don't realize that I've naturally encountered diphtheria, and then I bring it with me, and I encounter a Native American who I then give diphtheria to. And because no one in their tribe has probably had diphtheria, the rest of them all get it. So these are some. These are some protests that have recently happened. The one that's the most famous at this current time is the Keystone drilling. They want to put an oil pipeline through an indigenous people area, especially like sacred grounds. And so obviously these indigenous people are still fighting, as well as Keystone really wanted to put these oil, I think it's not rigs, because rigs go out elsewhere, the pipeline. So think about this and answer it at the bottom of your notes. Do you think the policies set in place in the 1800s still affect the population today? Why or why not? Support your claims. All right, guys, that's it.